Hi, I'm Alicia and I'm from thedizzycook.com, otherwise known as the Dizzy Cook, and I'm trying to get a little bit better at this YouTube thing. So I thought I would start with my vestibular migraine story, which I know a lot of people have done, and I've never really talked about it in video form. I've talked about it on my website, but I figured a small video, try to keep this as short as possible, talking about what I went through with my vestibular migraine journey and how I kind of found my own path. This was about 4 years ago. And it all started with coming back from a trip. We came back from a trip from Japan. I was gone for about 2 weeks, and I jumped right back into work, and I was feeling this dizziness, this lightheadedness, but I kind of brushed it off as a feeling of coming back from jet lag. And I remember shortly after that trip from Japan, we had to go to a wedding, and that weekend on the flight, I could feel my ears. They were really painful, and I still had that dizziness, but I felt like maybe it was a cold or something. So I was taking Afrin spray, and I called my general practitioner when I got back from that trip, and I just told her kind of what was going on. And she figured maybe it was like an ear infection or something like that, so they put me on a low dose of prednisone. And from there, I just didn't really feel any better. I just always had this background dizziness, and I kept brushing it off until it got worse. And one day I remember I was driving coworkers to lunch, and I felt as though I had put my car in park, and I felt like it was still moving forward, and I slammed on my brakes as hard as I could. And I kind of looked around and I was like, did anyone else feel that? And they all looked at me like I was nuts. And I had felt like I was moving forward at a pretty fast speed when I was completely in park in my car. And that's when I knew like I needed to get some like major help with this. So I bypassed my general practitioner and researched the best ENTs in Dallas. And so I got an appointment with this guy who was considered to be one of Dallas's best ENTs, and he did an evaluation. He tested me for things like BPPV, which I think a lot of people assume that's the cause of vertigo, which it can be for many, but it's just basically misplaced crystals in your ear. So I remember when I was telling people I was dizzy and having these feelings, they were like, well, did you check the crystals in your ear? Did you do the Epley maneuver? And I'm like, yes, I had all this checked for. I didn't have any hearing loss. See, they tested my hearing loss. I didn't have any of that. I just had these strange feelings that kept getting worse and worse. And so as it progressed, it just went from this background, lightheaded, floaty-headed feeling to a feeling like I was walking on marshmallows, or like the ground was moving up and down on me as I walked. Sometimes I felt like I was moving when I was sitting still, either dropping or like on a boat, like on waves. Sometimes I would feel like I was being moved back and forth. A lot of times I felt like my eyes were just overworked and tired. Sometimes I'd see things that weren't there, have different types of strange visual issues, and it really started to bother me, and the ENT couldn't figure it out. He sent me off to a dizzy sort of balance center with vestibular therapists. They ran all these tests there and decided I either had vestibular neuritis or I think that's what they decided at first. So instead, I went through about a month of very rigorous vestibular therapy. And at the same time, the ENT put me on a really strong course of prednisone. So sure enough, I started feeling a little bit better. And I thought I was making all of this progress. And then the second I stopped the prednisone, I just like totally backtracked into all my horrible symptoms where I couldn't drive, I couldn't get off my couch. I felt so sick all the time. And at this point, I also had a full-time job in watch development and design. So I was working for a pretty popular watch company in Dallas. And my boss at the time was pretty understanding, but it got to the point where I couldn't drive into work. So I was taking so much time off that I ended up having to file for FMLA, which basically is Family Medical Leave Act, which means you can take off work for an illness, but you usually have to have some kind of paperwork, like a doctor has to sign off on it to say you're sick. It's for some kind of reasoning. And because I didn't really have a diagnosis, my doctor was very hesitant to do that. So I had a lot of struggle between taking off my work, taking time away from work legally, and then also, trying to get a diagnosis. So in all of this, I was so frustrated after my month of doing all this vestibular therapy. I had spent thousands of dollars, in co-pays and appointments and everything to get nowhere. And I remember my husband came in to that appointment with me for the ENT and for the vestibular therapist. And the vestibular therapists were like, look, we've looked at your MRI and everything like that. The only thing that we've asked, this neurologist that we work for, the only thing that we can think of is maybe you have a perilimb fistula. And the ENT I saw said he had run out of options for me, couldn't think of anything else to help me, that I needed to see this dizzy doc in Dallas. And this dizzy doc, who is Dr. Bay, had like a 6-month wait list. So it was like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna lose my job. I'm newly married. I can't drive. Like, I'm basically gonna lose my life right here, and there's no one that can help me. One night I was so sick, I had a vertigo attack, and it was my first one, and I remember everything was just spinning around me, and I had never experienced anything so scary in my life. I felt like I had a brain tumor. This was not normal for anyone. So my husband took me to the ER, and that's when I was diagnosed with vertigo, which is a symptom. It's not a diagnosis, which I wish more ER doctors would know this. They sent me home with meclizine, and meclizine didn't do anything, didn't help me at all. And after that, I followed up with a few different neurologists who all told me I was either stressed, I had anxiety. Of course I did. Like, I was losing my mind. I was losing my job. Like, who wouldn't be stressed about this? This is insane. I hate that they tell women this, because I felt like the times that I brought in my husband to my doctor's appointments, the doctors took it so much more seriously with them in the appointment, and sometimes would just talk to my husband, which is terrible. But it's all because they didn't know about a diagnosis called vestibular migraine. And I ended up reaching out on Facebook. I was so desperate. I just said, look, friends, I don't care if we haven't spoken in 10 years. I am desperate for a doctor that knows what's wrong with me. I cannot live my life this way, and I need help. And so if you have any ideas of who can help me, I'll travel anywhere. I don't care. So I had a friend that knew a good doctor at the Mayo, Arizona. And so we actually drove, because of this potential perilimb fistula, we drove out to the Mayo, Arizona to go see a Dr. Peter Weiskopf, and he's actually very familiar with perilimb fistula, which was great. I spent about a day in very high-end testing at the Mayo, Arizona. I can't say enough good things about their testing. That's amazing. They do hearing tests, they do VNG and ENG. Sometimes they'll do it kind of blows air in your ear, and it's really uncomfortable, and it can make you more dizzy, but it just checks to make sure you don't have a vestibular weakness in your inner ear. And after all this testing, I went in the next day, and this doctor was an ENT, and he came in and he said, oh, you have vestibular migraine. And I said, what? He's like, you don't have a weakness in your inner ear. If you did have one, it's not there anymore. You have every component of vestibular migraine. And I said, well, that's crazy. I don't get headaches. I'm just getting this dizziness. I'm getting lightheadedness, vertigo attacks. I'm very sensitive to light and motion. And he says that this type of migraine can actually come with or without headache. And now I know that in studies, 1/4 up to 3/4 of people have reported no headaches with their symptoms. And it's actually only one part of the diagnostic criteria for vestibular migraine, along with like light and sound sensitivity. That's a big one too, that can occur with or without headache. And so it took me a while to kind of accept that diagnosis. And while I was out there in Arizona, I ended up getting a call that Dr. Bay had availability for me and could fit me in. And so, of course, we drove all the way back to Dallas. And Dr. Bay was the dizzy doc, just to remind you. And I saw him, and he ran his own set of tests, talked to me for a while about every symptom that I was experiencing. And sure enough, he was like, yes, you definitely have vestibular migraine. So all of this to say, this was about a 7-month process. And the only reason why I think I say this is short, I know people who have struggled with this for years. To me, it felt like forever. But I called for cancellations all the time to Dr. Bay's office. I just always pursued like the next thing. If someone couldn't help me, or if I didn't think they were right, I just kept pushing for the next diagnosis, the next person, the next expert, basically. And I think there's a point at which you become comfortable, like you get to someone who is qualified enough to truly believe their diagnosis. But there's also a part of you in your heart, if you feel like there's something else wrong, where you need to pursue that a little bit more. And I think that's where I kind of was when I went to Mayo and Dr. Bay. I trusted them both as qualified physicians who had dealt with this before, that they were going to make the right diagnosis for me. And after I got both of them on the same page, I felt like, okay, this is it. This is what I've got to pursue for treatment. So I will follow up on what I did to heal. Like right now, I'm 4 years later. I'm rarely have dizzy days at all. I'm so thankful. I'll share everything that I did in consecutive videos. But just to review some of the symptoms I had, so that feeling of walking on marshmallows, instability, like I was on one of those bounce houses where you can't quite get your balance. That's how I kind of felt. A lot of times I would, trip and fall or feel very unstable, or if I moved my head too fast, I would get this overwhelming dizzy feeling where I couldn't think. A lot of times when people were talking to me at work, I had trouble following the conversation mentally, or I would get a lot of brain fog. A lot of times I couldn't think of what I was going to say next, so I would call things thingy. I would say like, oh, can you get, instead of water bottle, I'd be like, can you hand me that thingy? Things like pen, I couldn't remember. Computer, I couldn't think of. It was like I had gone from someone who was so quick-witted to a complete idiot, and it was all because of this vestibular migraine. Some of the more scary symptoms were like some of the visual symptoms, seeing things that weren't there, the intense feelings of movement, so like I was moving forward or dropping. That was when things were at my worst, especially the vertigo attacks always happened when I was at my worst. And as things progressively got better, I started getting less light sensitive. I used to go to restaurants and it would be like crushing on my head, just the conversations from other tables, or if a door would open and close and have light behind it, it would bother me so much visually. Any sort of visual stimulation, driving, like the sticks that they have in the road or the lines for the HOV lane would drive my eyes nuts. And then as I slowly started to improve, my light sensitivity got better, my sound sensitivity got better, I got less sensitive to all those things. I would just get that feeling of background dizziness where I felt a little bit floaty in my head. And then also some of the forgetful symptoms I would also still get. Those were some of my last ones to go, but the really intense ones like the vertigo sensations and the visual sensations were some of the more intense symptoms that went once I got treatment. So I'll follow up, but you can read all of this on thedizzycook.com. Thanks.